Good afternoon. My name is Dana McGuire, and my presentation is on FEMA's Public Assistance Grant Program. So, the PA program was designed to provide assistance to specific private nonprofit organizations, disaster victims, and government organizations. However, PA grants are not available to private citizens or companies. And in order to receive grant money, there must be a presidential disaster declaration through the Stafford Act. The PA program was most recently amended under the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, which was originally enacted on January 29, 2013. In addition to amending the PA program, the SRIA had also amended the Stafford Act. And it was under this that the new public assistance policies were piloted, and as a result of that, uh, the PA program became FEMA's largest grant program. So the PA program was mainly designed to provide funding and relief for disaster victims. And in doing so, FEMA has created a designated state liaison, public assistance coordinators, and a project specialist to guide applicants through the process. Funding is mainly for debris removal, protective measures, repairing, replacing, restoring publicly owned facilities, and certain PMP facilities. A large part of the PA program is that it encourages preventative measures by providing assistance and hazard mitigation during the recovery phase. PA program was restructured in September of 2017. So, a little bit about the private nonprofit organizations that are eligible to receive funding is that they essentially must provide evidence that their facility is critical to helping victims of disasters and they serve the government a purpose. So, in order to do so, there are certain guidelines that they must follow, including having a ruling letter from the IRS granting tax exemption under certain codes, or evidence from the state that they're a non-revenue producing organization that is doing business under state law. So a few examples would be the Salvation Army, the American Red Cross, Feeding America, and even the Museum of Modern Art. So in order to receive assistance, the process begins with a disaster declaration. So the process of that would be that a disaster occurs, the state and local governments make their declarations, and then the governor will request a presidential declaration through FEMA. And once they have that declaration, there will be a preliminary damage assessment, which will basically document all damage that has occurred above specific levels. And after they do that, then the presidential declaration will determine eligibility between the public and private sectors to see how much funding will be granted to the state government. A large part of the PA program lies in prevention and protection. So, in addition to just providing funds after a disaster occurs, the PA program encourages actions to be taken by communities before a disaster occurs in order to reduce the risk of significant threats to both life and property. So some examples would be constructing temporary levees and roads, sandbagging important property, and removing structures that may pose like an immediate threat to life. So in the picture is a good example because it shows how a farm has taken measures to protect land should like the channel overflow. In addition to prevention and protection, hazard mitigation is also important. However, the federal government does not provide funding for hazard mitigation. That's done specifically through the state under the Stafford Act. So for hazard mitigation, opportunities are usually available wherever damage is repetitive and can often be fixed with a singular repair. To receive funding through the state, applicants must submit a hazard mitigation proposal, which is different for each event because there are only written descriptions and a cost analysis of what will be needed to repair current damage or something that will protect the public from future damage. So an example would be in the picture to the right of temporary levees that have been placed to prevent the flooding of roads. As stated before, private individuals are not eligible to receive grants under the PA program. However, states, tribal nations, local governments, and PNPs are. So applicants will submit a project worksheet after the president declares an emergency, and the project worksheet is essentially just an itemized estimated cost list of all the materials, equipment, manpower, and so on that are needed to complete a project. So because aid takes it takes about 2 months to get to the applicant, there is an immediate needs funding program, which are grants set aside by the federal government that are specifically for the most urgent work needed initially after a disaster. So those are paid within the first 60 days, as opposed to having to wait 60 days to see if you will receive aid. And those are mainly for debris removal, equipment, overtime payroll, and the removal of safety and health hazards. So the eligibility for PA grants is that applicants obviously, again, must be state, local governments, PNPs, or federally recognized tribal governments. And then the facility must be in the disaster area, and it is the responsibility of the applicant to be aware of their location and make sure it falls in to that disaster location. So the work, they must prove that the damage did not occur before the storm and that it happened because of a disaster and not simply just their own negligence. The cost is that grants will be given reasonably and by necessity. So there are two categories of work covered by FEMA, and that's emergency and permanent work. The main difference is that emergency work grants will be given sooner, and that's just debris removal and emergency protective measures, as opposed to permanent work, which is the rebuilding of roads and bridges, water control facilities and utilities, buildings and equipment, and parks and recreational facilities. The application process occurs through 3 main touch points, and then there will be 3 remaining phases. So initially, the applicant will be briefed by their delivery manager. Then they will have an exploratory call, which just is to get an initial sense of what needs to be done and identify who will be in charge of the project. And then there's the recovery scope meeting, which is more in depth. They gather more documentation and develop a list of projects needed based on priority. The 3 remaining phases that occur after 60 days would be the intake damage and eligibility analysis, just to see what has been documented and what needs to still be done. The scoping and costing, which will be on-site visits and will be again reviewed for further eligibility. And then the final review and sign off, which is just assurance reviews for accuracy, and then the project acceptance by the applicant. And then after that, the victim will receive. So the administration of funds is that the federal government will provide no less than 75% of the final cost. And then the recipient, which is usually the state or local government, will decide how the remaining 25% of the cost is dispersed. After that is done, government will disperse the grants. And then throughout the process, FEMA will continue to monitor aid just to make sure that it's being used and dispersed within a timely manner and in line with federal laws and regulations. The PA program is FEMA's largest grant program, and as of 2017, it administers about $4.7 billion a year and does take up 51% of all FEMA's grants.